So I appreciate everybody signing in. Today we're going to talk a little bit about getting back to work in a COVID environment. We've got Alyson Mathews from Lamb Barnosky, and we have Barry Ackerman from SupportiveHR. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Before we get into it, I just want to tell you a little bit about Imperial Advisory. We're a group of fractional CFOs, and the way I think about the business is that in large organizations, CFOs are often the most trusted advisor to the CEO. And when you use a fractional CFO, you can get a very high level of experience to help you out just for a fraction of the cost. Several of the CFOs in our group have held C-suite positions throughout their careers, and most of us have 30 to 40 years of experience. Imperial picks up where your accounting or your bookkeeping firm might leave off, and we also could serve as a second set of hands for your CFO. And in addition to being general business advisors, we have M&A experience. We can give advice on that. We can assist in decision making throughout all aspects of the organization. So that's enough about me. I think I'll turn this over to Alyson now to introduce herself, and then off to Barry, and then we'll get going. This should be an interactive webinar. Things are changing quite a bit right now. Every day there's new news coming out. There's new regulations, and people are doing different things with their teams in terms of testing and vaccinations and things like that. And so I would, we're not necessarily looking to have a presentation and then a Q&A. We're really happy to take regular breaks, field questions as they come up. So Alyson, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you so much. So as was indicated, I'm Alyson Mathews. I work for Lamb Barnosky. I'm a partner there. I've been doing labor and employment law for 16 years, almost exclusively, plus another couple years experience where I did that and some other things. I work and represent with public and private sector employers, and I do everything. I sit down at the table with unions and negotiate collective bargaining agreements. I do employee handbooks, I do policy review, I do administrative hearings for discrimination, disciplinary cases, you name it, I've done it, soup to nuts, everything labor and employment.
Barry?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And as mentioned, I have a company called SupportiveHR that I started. We provide HR consulting. Just to drop a background who I am before we talk about that. So I'm actually trained as an accountant. I'm a recovering accountant. And I transitioned to HR a number of years ago, first with payroll, and then got involved in other areas of HR. And I become certified by SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, credential that basically says I know a thing or two about HR. I'm not an attorney. I don't pretend to be one. I know a good bit of employment law, enough to keep my clients out of trouble as long as they, do what I say for the most part. I mean, I'm not an attorney. I keep people like Alyson in my network because they always come in handy. There are certain things that HR can handle. And then there's a time when HR says, you know what, we're going to have to reach out to some higher level. And you'll excuse me, my throat is bothering me today, so please forgive me if I don't sound so clear. If I end up coughing a little bit, I apologize in advance. So after doing HR internally for a number of years, as an HR manager and HR director in a couple of different companies, I saw there was a need in the small and medium-sized companies. They were really neglecting their HR matters because basically they're busy just running their operation. They didn't even think about hiring a full-time HR person. They're a small company, 10, 15, 20, even 30 or 40 employees. Many companies don't even think about their HR needs. So I started helping them out originally on a part-time basis while I was doing full-time HR as an employee. It got to the point where in order to be able to really service my clients the way they needed the service to be done. So I went out on doing that full-time now for about 2 years, a little over 2 years now. So I help small companies, whether it's policy writing, employee handbooks, getting them through a Department of Labor audit that might come up, dealing with employee situations that come up, whether it's a leave situation or just, disputes or relationship issues going on in the workplace. Management sometimes needs someone to reach out to with a little bit of HR expertise. So we are those people that management can reach out to. So that's what SupportiveHR does. That's what I do. Should we just give a little bit of intro, Bob? How do you want to move forward? Should I jump a little bit into the topic? We'll speak for a few minutes and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, Barry, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from your clients? What kind of topics are coming up? What do you want to tell people to be thinking about right now?
Yeah, sure. So the topic was, I think, was how to return to work. I think that was the title of the webinar. And before we even talk about how, I would actually talk about why for a moment, because I actually had just in the last couple of weeks, for everyone, it's been heating up now. Those, Labor Day was kind of that date when a lot of companies said they were going to come back, come back to the office. And the whole thing in New York City with the teachers union, there's been a lot of stuff going on with people having to come back, vaccinated, not vaccinated, all the different things going on. So just anecdotally, I had a couple of situations in the last week or so on different sides of the table with an employee who came to me and said, I've been working from home for a year and a half, whatever it is, a little more than that at this point. And he's really, his kind of position, he's doing just fine. And we're working from home. And now they told him he's part of a very large organization and, blanket policy, everyone's got to come back full time. And he said, I really don't have to. I'm getting the job done. No one has any complaints about my performance. And I'm not commuting now. You're making me commute. You're going to have to pay $20 a day in parking from where the office is. So it's just, I don't want to do that. So he called me up basically saying, should I, and he's thinking about looking for another job. Do I think it's a good idea? Do I think there's anything out there? And does it make sense? And I said, I can't tell you what to do, but I definitely hear your concerns. Your organization made a blanket rule. Everyone's got to come back, whether it makes sense for everyone or not. They just said, we don't want to deal with it. Everyone's got to come back. So I said to him, if you have a good opportunity that's going to allow you to continue to work remotely, that you won't have to pay $20 a day in parking, you won't have to spend 3 hours a day in commuting, and your childcare issues will be much simpler because you won't have to worry. There's so many other things that go along with not having to commute and being able to work from home. If it works, obviously, if you're in a manufacturing environment, you can't manufacture from home. But if you're an accounting firm, if you're a marketing firm, if you're a legal firm, a lot of different things, you may be able to work from home, if not full-time, at least part-time, a couple days a week, a couple days a month. Different companies have introduced different systems that they're going to be using. And I had an employer also call me up. They're looking for somebody. And, if I know anyone in a particular position. And as we were talking, I said, what are you looking to pay? And they didn't really want someone with that much experience, but of course they wanted someone with more experience, but they didn't want to pay that much. Nice combination. And then I said, by the way, is this working from home or it's in the office? I said, it's in the office. We're back. So I said, you're fighting an uphill battle because you're not looking to pay a whole lot. You are requiring that they come back to the office. People have been working from home for a while, and in this particular position that they're looking for, there's no reason why that position could not be done from home at least a couple days a week. So, they want to be sticklers and say, no, everyone's got to come back. Well, then pay for it. Make it worth someone's while to get on the train every day and sit.
But Barry, if I were a sole proprietor or a small business owner, I would suggest that, did that person take a cut and pay when they stopped coming into the office? And, it's really not the employer's, the employer didn't drive this situation. And the fact that they saved the commuting time, that they're not paying for the gas anymore, they didn't take a cut and pay. I can see it from the employer's side too. Alyson, you heard anything about this from your side?
So I understand the blanket rule. As an employment attorney, I like blanket rules. I like rules that are across the board, that don't leave wiggle room, don't leave discretion, because that gives opportunities for people to draw lines along protected classifications. And then you get into an area where you're trying to justify and rationalize why you did something. And that opens the door for an employee to say, well, you did this you let so-and-so work from home because they're fill in the blank, female, male, a particular background. You didn't let me because I'm not. So the more it can be a blanket rule, or by work departments, by anything else that is a concrete definitive standard that doesn't tie to any classifications, that's better. We're of course all human, so it's natural to want to sympathize with people who have the commuting pains and the childcare pains. but the more you leave it kind of loosey-goosey, the more trouble you're going to end up in. But it is absolutely up to an employer whether they want people to return to the office. I think Barry makes excellent points on the workforce and what's going on and how it's changed throughout the past year and a half, that getting more than a year and a half at this point, maybe, that people might not want to go back to the way things were with their commuting. And that's going to be up to the employer to decide whether they want to continue a remote or a hybrid workplace, and whether their workforce, they need that kind of in-person collaboration that you get in the office. There are going to be certain jobs that you just can't do at home. And those are probably the jobs where people didn't get the luxury of having to be home for the last year and a half. The other issue that employers are going to face as you try to force people to come back to work is whether there's any sort of accommodation, because you'll have employees come out of the woodwork and say, well, if I come back, it's going to be a risky situation for me, or I have a disability that doesn't allow me to come back to work. So those are going to be factual situations where I would consider you reach out to someone like Barry or someone like me to walk you through what you have to do. Because at this point, now that we're not all on lockdown, the rules about making you offer someone that work from home position are not what they were before. And you don't have an obligation, legally speaking, to continue to offer that to someone. And there's a difference between accommodating someone who has a risk, which you really don't have to do, versus someone who physically can't come into work, which you might have to do. If you look at EEOC regulations, they have all sorts of rules that have been very relaxed since this pandemic hit. So things that employers could never get away with doing, down to, taking a temperature. If you would have asked any of us a year and a half ago, can an employer make you take your temperature when you walk in the door? It would have been unheard of. And the same things are going on with these remote assignments and trying to get people back. So the rules right now, they're different. I know there's a lot of talk about that and how it's affecting people's rights and their responsibilities, but public health at the moment is trumping those things in those areas.
Interesting. And just to extend this question to a little bit further. So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is you would advise employers to have a set of rules, like remote works this way, in office works this way. You don't want to make it too negotiable employee by employee. Is that correct?
Yes, I would recommend they have a telecommuting or remote work policy that lays out who's eligible, when they're allowed to do it, and when it gets revoked.
Mm-hmm. And what about employees who interact with customers?
I'm sorry, I can't. There's some background noise. I can't make out what you're saying. Could you repeat that?
Okay. Yes, sure. So what I was asking is, so we've got to make reasonable accommodations for people coming back to work. We've got to secure their safety. What happens when our people have to interact with customers and they have different policies than we do?
So when someone is coming into your workplace, you get to set the rules. And if the customers don't want to comply, you have the right to say they're not allowed to be in there. And you can put the employees in charge of enforcing those rules, or you can leave it up to management to enforce the rules too. But those are the conditions for coming into the workplace. You have an obligation to keep your employees safe and to provide that safe workspace. So you can't just open the floodgates and not enforce the rules.
And if you're in a business, let's say just a hypothetical. Let's say that you're a roofer, or you're putting siding on the outside of a house, or you're a maintenance person for the property, the lawn maintenance and that type of thing. Does that impact the client or the customer's ability to say people can't come on my property that are not vaccinated?
So I guess if a client, and in the construction example you gave, if they don't want someone to come on the property without being vaccinated, that's their right. It has nothing to do with the company. The company can require employees to be vaccinated. There's some certain exceptions to those rules, but customers could say that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's interesting. All right. Anybody that's just if we could take a 30-second pause here and say, is there anybody on the call that has a follow-up question or wants to, has something they want to talk about or ask about on this particular topic?
Yeah, Bob, I had a follow-up question on that topic. As
Sure.
far as vaccination goes and getting back to the office, if there's going to be blanket rules established, for example, there's no remote working and everyone does have to get vaccinated, regardless if you're, let's say, pregnant or for any other reason don't want to get the vaccine, is there a certain point where to make reasonable accommodations? And are you open to, let's say, is there liability that you're open to because you're not making those accommodations?
So the answer to that is yes. So there are, and I always recommend that when you get into these issues with whether you have to accommodate someone, that you bring medical professionals into this, because I know I'm not a lawyer. Barry described himself as a recovering accountant. I've never been a recovering doctor, so I don't know, maybe I said lawyer. I don't know those issues, but someone needs to come to you and say, I have this condition confirmed by medical documentation. And if it is a disability as the law defines it, and there's something about returning to work in person that disability impacts, you have a legal obligation to engage in what's called an interactive dialogue. And the employer's obligation is to reasonably accommodate that disability so that someone can perform their essential job function. And if my essential job function is coming into the office and getting there, that's something that might have to be accommodated. And that interactive discussion, once you have it confirmed, and you can have the doctor provide information on this as well, is let's talk about what's going on with you. What can we do to allow you to come back to work? And the standard is reasonable. So you do have to consider what the employee is asking for. You might not have to give them what they're asking for. So if you no longer offer a remote assignment and they want one, that's not something that you can do. But you can say, look, we're not doing remote work anymore, but your desk is situated here. What if we put plexiglass around the borders? What if I taped the floor to make sure that everyone knows to stay, instead of 3 feet, they have to stay 6 feet from you? Well, those are things that you can talk to the employee about doing, even if you can't give them exactly what they want.
So in terms of a reasonable accommodation, what about the rights of the employee who is vaccinated and doesn't want to be around unvaccinated people? How does that sort of fit into this equation?
Barry, you want to take that one? I don't know if that's a quite a legal type issue.
I mean, I'm not sure if I understand the question. Are you talking about an employer who required everyone?
No. I'm talking about you're in an office. You've got 10 people working there, and you've got a couple of people that are willing to come back to work, but they don't want to be around unvaccinated people, and you don't have a policy that says everybody has to be vaccinated. Do those employees have any rights? Anything that how do we handle that?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I'll hand it over to Alyson, but I think similar to what Alyson was just describing, you can also.
I'm trying to stump the panel here. Just to let
no, the same idea that Alyson was just saying. Listen, we're not requiring. It's sort of the flip side. Alyson was saying where we are requiring. Here we're saying, listen, we're not requiring everyone to be vaccinated. People have their preferences, and we're going to respect that. We understand that you're sensitive to it and you'd like to be not with people that are unvaccinated. Here's what we can do. The same thing, whether it's plexiglass, other side of the office, we'll try to keep things as separate as possible or spaced out so that you'll be comfortable. But we're not requiring our employees to vaccinate. It's a personal decision and we're going to respect that. Basically, the same conversation Alyson was just describing, but just flip it around the other direction. Alyson, what would you say?
Well, the other thing I would say is it also depends on what you're doing in your workplace, because over the summer, the rules got a little bit relaxed and now the recommendations have kind of swung back the other way. And I know my office rules changed. So at one point, if you were vaccinated, you didn't have to wear the mask inside. And the way that we approached it was, if you choose to share your vaccination status and you provide us the proof that you're vaccinated, you no longer have to wear a mask inside. So that meant that anyone who wasn't vaccinated or just didn't want to disclose it had a choice. And I think that's the same thing here. But you want to kind of stay away from necessarily disclosing to other employees whether their coworkers are vaccinated or not vaccinated, because that's medical information that really shouldn't be shared. And I think what you can do is, as Barry said, you have that conversation with someone else that if they're not comfortable in the workplace, then what can we do to make you feel safer within reason? Because what we're talking about here is not an accommodation. I don't have any obligation to accommodate fear, but I do have an obligation to make sure you are safe.
Oh, that's interesting. But
Hey, Bob, I have a quick question.
Yes, sure.
Can I just jump in? Alyson, it's an interesting point. You don't want to share people's medical information, right? HIPAA and all that stuff. But if I'm wearing a mask, everyone knows I'm not vaccinated under that policy, right?
Not necessarily, because you might be one of those people who doesn't want to disclose and you might be vaccinated. Or you might be someone who it doesn't matter whether you're vaccinated, you're still wearing a mask.
Okay.
How is this any different than, for instance, I have a school-age child who we need to proof all different vaccinations before they attend school. Even colleges these days, you got to prove you're vaccinated. Other, polio, this, that. Why all of a sudden are we not disclosing vaccination when we have? If you're in a public school, you've been vaccinated, right? For the most part. I mean, I guess there are some exceptions, but
there are some exceptions, but that's a law that's in effect for kids to go to school. They have to have certain vaccinations. A few years ago, they did away with some of the exceptions for, I think it was the measles vaccination, and parents had a choice. They either kept their kids in school and got them vaccinated or pulled them. And I know there were some parents that pulled, but yes, you do know that those kids are vaccinated for those mandatory ones, but so for me, I don't consider what we do with the kids to be in the same category as what we're doing with our employees.
I don't see the difference.
But it's a state, because it's a state law. Like, this is what a child has to do in order to go and attend public school, right? They could have all sorts of other vaccinations that the school district might be aware of, but the school district's not disclosing that to anyone else. You have to provide proof of vaccination to get in the door, right? It's the same thing with your workplace to a certain extent. You want to come into the workplace, if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, then yes, someone would have to put that in there. But there is going to be someone, most likely in your workplace, that's going to be exempt, because you might have someone who's immunocompromised that cannot get the vaccine, and you have to be able to accommodate that.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I have another question, similar question. So I remember hearing over the summer sometime, I don't know if it's a requirement or a recommendation, but that if someone needs time off to get vaccinated, the employer has to give that time, and I believe it's compensated. Is that true?
I believe that law is still in place, that you get time off to get vaccinated for however many doses that you get. And there's also some guaranteed time off, I think, if you have any side effects that prevent you from working.
Okay, so my follow-up question to that is, so now, since we're talking about this vaccinated, unvaccinated situation, I guess we could have a policy that required people to get tested. Who compensates the employee for that time?
That's up to the employer.
Okay,
I
so there's no guidelines on it.
There's no, and that's and I know Barry's going to jump in here too, but so for example, you have the state, the school employees who now have to get vaccinated or get tested. And for them, whether they get paid time off for that testing, it's a subject of negotiations if they're in a union. If they're not in a union, it could be a wage and hour issue, but it's uncharted waters. We don't know how the Department of Labor is going to rule on that, whether it's something that you're required to do, therefore you have to be compensated, or whether it's something outside of work.
Gotcha. Barry, you were going to weigh in?
Nothing to add there.
Okay. So Barry, why don't you keep this going? Bring up other things that you've been hearing out there.
So, so those were a couple of anecdotal items, and it's funny because then I actually stumbled across an article in the Harvard Business Review, which really spoke to it, not just anecdotally, some very interesting numbers. And that they said 40% of employees would look for a new job if they're required to return to work full time in the office. 40% is a big number. So yeah, I keep playing that side of the coin. I know, like, again, it wasn't the title of the presentation, but it's just something to think about. That 40% is a big number of people that are going to look to jump ship if they have to come back full time. Not to say a hybrid model. Hybrid model, people are much more comfortable with that. But if employers are going to require 5 days a week, they need to expect they're going to have a nice amount of churn, or they're going to have to compensate that, which is another number they had. I think they said, yeah, Goldman. They said the Goldman announced that they're going to be giving their new hires an increase of 30% salary increase over what previously the new hires were being paid. So that's a big number. That's a big jump, because Goldman is requiring that their employees come to the office. So they're realizing in order to do that, they're going to have to pay 30% more to make that more palatable.
Are they doing that for current employees too?
I saw that they're doing that for new hires.
Okay.
I saw the PwC, PwC made the news last week when they announced that people could work from home basically full time. They said they have to come in, I think, 3 days a month. But they also said that if employees are going to relocate to lower cost of living areas, I don't know all the parameters of how they're defining that, then they may lower their salaries. So if someone's been living in Manhattan and now they decide to move to a ranch in Wyoming, that's fine, but they might get a salary decrease, which might be worth it. I don't know. I can't speak for anybody, but I did see that.
And that, going back to what we were talking about with your telecommuting policies too, for the small businesses that are impacted by this as well, when someone's living somewhere else, they might be subject to different wage and hour laws. So if you want to prevent that from happening and say, if you're going to telecommute, you have to reside in New York, New Jersey, wherever, in Pennsylvania, wherever you might be, because trying to manage different states' wage and hour rules is going to be very cumbersome for a small business.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
absolutely.
a really interesting question. So you're saying if you've been a New York-based company, you've got your handbook, everything's all under control, and somebody picks up and moves to Virginia, you've now got a Virginia employee, right?
They're working in Virginia.
Wow.
So this wasn't planned, but we have a PEO guy on here, Isaac. So a little plug for PEOs. We have a PEO, and I notice, at least on my payroll stuff, that they just automatically apply the right taxes from the right state and deal with all that stuff. Does PEO solve the issues we're talking? If you have a PEO which has a presence in all the states, does that solve the issues that we're bringing up now? Meaning Jennifer, who's on the line here, Jennifer is working in California. We had someone for a while working in New Jersey. We've had people in New York, Pennsylvania, I think, as well at one point. But we pay everyone through the PEO. We have, in theory, I guess everyone's employed by the PEO.
It doesn't seem like Isaac is answering, but from my experience, what I've seen.
No, I wasn't asking
PEOs,
him. I was asking the panel. I was just.
Oh, I thought you were asking Isaac as well.
Okay. From my experience working with PEOs, I believe that is the case. That's one of the advantages of working with a PEO. Obviously, working with a PEO with a lot of advantages. It's not a fit for everybody, and this is not a PEO conversation. But yeah, that is something that a PEO would help with. But really, any reputable payroll company should be able to assist with that. I mean, well, with the taxes. This each individual state rules and leave requirements. There are other things that will come up. Yeah, PEOs will generally help with that. There are other ways, obviously, to deal with that as well. But yeah, it's an important thing to realize that if now someone moves to Virginia, bingo, you have a Virginia employee now.
That's interesting. Alyson, anything you want to add to that?
I think we covered that one, but I think it's something to watch, because even though you can have your PEO or your payroll company handle the pay, there might be other issues that come up with different state laws.
But if you don't have a PEO, it sounds to me like you'd have to reach out to someone like yourself or someone like Barry to help you make sure your policy manual's up to date and that you're following the right rules.
Correct.
That's something I hadn't thought about. That's interesting.
And just one more point on that. It's just another area where, you know, you can say, well, we're not going to let you move to Virginia because we're only in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So those are your 3 states you can choose from. Your employee may or may not listen to you. They may say, listen, I want to live in Virginia, and if you're not going to keep me employed, fine, I'm going to find another job. So it's another thing to add to the mix. You know, yes, employers can make rules, but it's up to employees. You know, it's a free country. It's employment at will. So there's a lot of there are a lot of things to juggle over here. That's all.
Yeah. That's one thing we hadn't talked about yet, which I know there's been I've heard a lot of different things out there. What are you hearing about what happens when somebody tests positive? You're in an office environment and one of the employees tests positive. What are people doing out there when that happens?
So I don't know what they are doing. I can tell you what they should be doing. And I always say you got to look.
Well, there's always a difference in that.
There's
right?
always most difference, right? Someone once told me that one lawyer told them, you don't have to take our advice, you just have to pay for it. So I'm sure Barry's in the same boat. But what you should be doing is immediately get that person out of the workplace. If they can't get out of the workplace, you need to isolate them from everyone else until they can leave. And then you need to follow all the CDC and local health department guidelines in terms of cleaning up the area, doing any contact tracing, and making sure everyone else is safe. That could entail notifying other employees that there was an exposure. I wouldn't do it. It depends on what's going on in your workplace, whether you do it across the board or whether you just talk to the people who are potentially exposed. But sometimes it's better to be, and it's not really a legal matter, but it's better to be proactive sometimes rather than the rumor mill churning and people thinking, how could you not have told me this? You can't identify who tested positive and whether employees figure it out. Oh, well, as long as the employer isn't the one disclosing it, it's fine. But you do need to make sure that those protocols are followed. And I even have clients often, if they're not quite sure what to do or how to follow the trail, get on the phone with the local health department and have them walk you through it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's what they're there for.
That's interesting. So there's no obligation to sort of trace who's been exposed for an employer.
Well, employers aren't really the ones tracing, but you do have to work with the local health department to figure out who may have been in close contact, because what happens when you have someone who tests positive or they're identified as a close contact, the Department of Health starts with the positive person. But the flaw in the system is, unless it's a school building with students where they have it down to a science and they know exactly who's sitting around the kids and the teachers, and they can, tell you exactly who was a close contact. But in the real world, it's not so easy. So you need to work with them. That's why we suggest calling the Department of Health so they can walk you through, because otherwise you're relying on the person who tested positive to identify who they were close to. And I don't know if it's 10 minutes or 15 minutes, but it's a collective 10 to 15 minute period of time. And the radius around the person varies depending on whether both people were masked or unmasked. And there's all sorts of little caveats to it, and it's constantly changing. So I always say, call the Department of Health, say where it was. Your best guess might be that you're overly inclusive in terms of who should leave and get tested and when they can come back. I'm okay with that under these circumstances. I wouldn't always be, but in a pandemic, 100%.
Okay. Anybody in the group that has any questions? Anything else that anybody's thinking about that you want us to address here? Jennifer, is there anything on the chat line?
No, nothing on the chat.
Okay. So I have another question. So if you were hired as a sales, I'm going to just pick on sales for a second. It could be any number of positions, but if you were hired as a salesperson, say a few years back, and you spent 40% or 60% or 80% of your time on the road visiting customers, in the current environment, can the employer ask you to go back to that kind of travel, or would that be a problem?
What would be the problem? What would be the potential problem?
Person doesn't want to travel?
It's a requirement of the job. It's always been a requirement of the job. I'll let Alyson,
I don't think it's any
add,
different from
yeah.
what Barry identified before, that there's going to be a push-pull, whether employees want to go back to that routine or not. An employer gets to decide whether to require it, and employees can decide whether they want to keep doing it or start doing it again.
Okay.
If you can show that you're as productive, if not more productive, in sales sitting in your living room, why would an employer even, I know they could, require it, but wouldn't it be in their best interest to say, just keep doing what you're doing? You're doing a great job the last 18 months. We don't want to change anything. So
that's not a legal question. That's up to like you said, it'd be the employer. The employer can have a conversation and say, I feel like it's working out pretty well lately. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or the employer might say, well, listen, but this is a company policy that we've introduced, and therefore we can't make exceptions, which that might be the case. Or they'll say, you know what, maybe for sales, we don't have to require it for sales, because maybe for sales, if it's working out, it's working out, and we can come up with a policy that as long as it's working, as long as you're hitting certain numbers, we can continue to work from home. And if the numbers are suffering, then we may have to bring you back in or send you back out. I guess I should say, send you back out on the road. But yeah, as long as it's not discriminatory, again, like Alyson was talking about earlier, yeah, that's the conversation for the employer and the employee to have.
No, and I agree. That's the logical business answer. But we all know we've not always worked for logical people in the past, right? And sometimes we're asked to do things that may not necessarily make sense, and you can even prove that they don't make sense. I was just curious what the employer could do about that. So that all makes sense. Barry, in your practice, I don't know if you get involved in this, but if you had clients come to you about I hate to use the word emotional, but has there been extra stress in the workplace? I know there has been, but has anybody come to you with the extra stress? How are employers addressing that? Is there any sort of new niche businesses that have popped up for this? Is this something that we should be concerned about right now?
So yeah, I personally haven't come across any real issues. Nothing more intense than what we've just been talking about, where the company says, listen, the policy is we need people to come back. You like it, you don't like it, this is what it is. I haven't really seen, the strong pushback that you're asking about. Some employees obviously are not happy about it, and they'll ask for accommodations, and we'll get into that conversation. But I haven't seen, you're talking about the kind of like emotional support. I haven't seen anything like that from my experience, no.
And I only see it a little bit. Again, it's not a legal requirement, but it can be a good morale to address those types of issues, because sometimes if you let them fester, they breed discrimination claims, even meritless discrimination claims. So you want to deal with them and confront them. And as the right thing to do, you probably want to make sure your employees are okay and handling everything. And especially now with the way offices keep changing.
Yeah.
We have a question from Mike.
Yes. So a bit of a different question. When you're in the earlier stages of, let's say, where you have to make these decisions.
Alarm clock for 7 a.m.
Where you have to make the decision of okay, there's going to be 15 people. Each one needs to be paid whatever, a certain amount of money. Is there a convincing argument when you're more in a technical early stage company, kind of a convincing argument of this company needs to be 100% remote. We're going to use these sophisticated modern tools that everyone has to know. And that's the way the company should be formed. Is there a convincing way to persuade, the stakeholders so-called the investors, that you want to enforce that policy over, oh, you have to have a pool table here and you have to have a swimming pool here and everyone has to congregate every day? Is there a way to avoid, to aim for a purely remote a company, and how you can kind of work that into an argument with the stakeholders involved?
I think that's similar. It's an employee-employer conversation. I don't think that gets into any legal areas necessarily. There are plenty of companies that are set up 100% remote, where there is no central office to speak of. Each employee may have an office in their home, but there is no corporate office. We all know there are certainly companies out there. So I'm not sure if I understood your question, but basically, were you asking, like, is there a way for an employee or a group of employees to kind of present that to management? Which my response is, sure, go for it. If management buys into it, then why not? I'm not sure if that's what you're asking though.
Gershon, I think if you could weigh in on this for a second, let me just make a quick comment, and then I'd be curious to see what you had to say. What I thought I heard, which is really interesting, is you're putting together a company, you're looking for an investor group, or maybe you're looking to attract employees, and you're communicating that your company culture is to be 100% remote. Just like some companies put out. I get it. The pool tables, the ping pong tables, the relaxed atmosphere. This is it's another version of company culture. And we're a company that's technologically advanced. We're tracking our people in a more sophisticated way. Everybody works from home, and that's what our company culture is. And that potentially would attract a different type of investor. I think that's what the question was around. Gershon, what do you think?
That's a better way to word it. Thank you.
Okay.
What do I think? Not my.
We work with you and I work with startups, right?
Yes,
This is an interesting company culture that you would have to find an investor that embraced that environment. And if they embraced it and supported it, that would be a good partner for you. I could see putting together an investment memo or a teaser or a confidential information memorandum on that, and you would attract a certain type of investor.
Yeah, it's kind of what Barry was saying and what you're saying. Barry was talking about it vis-a-vis the employees, and you're talking about vis-a-vis the investors. But especially when you're dealing with startups, and I just had a conversation with, I'll tell you that later. I had a conversation with an attorney about this yesterday, that a lot of these things are on some level of negotiation. The question is who values what and what are they willing to trade? And so with the employees, it's money, it's flexibility, it's the office culture, these are the things you're playing, you're modifying. And with investors, there's sometimes other things. You have people, I know that when I used to work in bonds, we had people who were willing to invest in deals that qualified as green deals, and they were potentially willing to accept a lower rate of return because that was their mandate. They had people who wanted that. And so when we're talking about this kind of stuff, you could have investors who would be willing to pay up, would be willing to pay more, which means get potentially a lower yield, even if they don't think that a fully remote company is necessarily more profitable. Maybe they think it's better for the employees and they care about the employees. Maybe they think it'll be easier to market. Maybe they think it'll ultimately produce more profits, though I can say I don't think that's the case for green people, for the green bonds and that kind of stuff. I don't think people were in it for the money. They were in it for other reasons. But it depends. It's about matching the right people with the right investors, the right employees, whichever side we're taking, with the right company and the right policies. And yeah.
So thanks for that question. I think it's a really good angle to build a culture around that. I do like that approach. And any other questions from the people that have dialed in? That shows my age. Any other comments?
Well, I have one question, and then if we don't have anything else, then we'll have a quick poll, and then I don't know. Jennifer asked me to turn that on. My question is, we're talking about employers. There's Goldman, who says you got to come back to the office, but we'll pay you more. And there's PwC, who says go work from home and probably lots of other companies in different industries that don't, strictly speaking, need to be done in the office, but some of them want you in, some of them don't. I've heard people claim over the last 18 months that it's not just about, can you get your job done? Can you go through the motions, that there's culture. I've heard, especially from accounting firms, not PwC, I guess, but other accounting firms that are very concerned about how they're going to train junior employees, how they're going to build company culture. And that kind of transcends a lot of the issues we're talking about. So there might be, if we work our way around the legal issues, is there something, and people can do their job, is there something else that either the people or the company are really losing out on by this trend toward work from home?
Well, okay, I mean, I'll jump in. I think that's more of an HR angle question than legal. I'm sure Alyson has something to add also, but let me just lay something out. Yeah, I think what you're doing is you're taking benefits. Someone that's, they're excited to have everyone working from home because no one wants to commute, and everyone, they can sit in their pajamas or whatever else. But like you said, there's a trade-off. You don't have the same level of camaraderie. You may not have the same level of teamwork where people can, walk down the hall and pop their head into someone's office and sort of, bang, knock something around for 15 minutes till they come up with a good solution. That doesn't always happen on a video call. Video calls are not as spontaneous as, knocking on the office down the hall from you and then just, knocking, batting something around. So yeah, I think there's a trade-off. And I think these companies are aware of that trade-off. I don't think they're oblivious to it. I think they thought about it and they decided that they're trading one for the other. You can't have both. If you want people to come into the office because you feel strongly that the FaceTime is important and they can walk down the hall and just sit there and bat things around and build a culture better that way with a ping pong table or without a ping pong table, but it works better in the office. There certainly is, they have data backing them up. I mean, it's true. There's no question about it. People are more collaborative. Okay, I'm going to go on the record. I'm not going to go on the record and say that. But it seems, and one can argue definitely, that people are more collaborative when they're all in the office. And I can hear that argument. And someone else will argue back and say, yeah, but people are more motivated when they can sit at home and they don't have to spend an hour and a half commuting each way. So they're both right. So I think companies, weigh those things. If you're talking about big companies, Goldman, PwC, they thought of all these things. They didn't just flip a coin and decide, okay, we'll just stay home. I think they thought about all these things, and this was a decision that they made. And Goldman thought about those things and made a different decision. So yeah, there's things pulling in both directions.
Well, I can almost understand Goldman's decision better. I mean, I had a friend who worked there as a junior employee. He told me he used to work like 18 hours a day. He said his productivity dropped after 12. But you can't sustain that kind of culture with people working on their couches. People aren't you need to be, have everybody else that you're still at the desk at 2 a.m. for you to stay.
And I think if you took commuting time and expense out of the conversation, it would be a different conversation. If you could go to your office and work from home and the commute and the expense was exactly the same, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. But I know from my own office, I am much more likely to pop my head into someone's office and just vent about something or say, hey, I've got this issue, what do you think? Than I am to pick up the phone. And it's not necessarily the same. We have 2 new attorneys in my office. I think it'd be very hard to, spontaneously I could say, hey, what are you doing? You don't look busy. Come with me. I'm going and I'm doing union negotiations. Come sit in. You don't get that when you're all in different locations. But I think it's something that's, I don't think there's a substitute for in-person face-to-face contact for some industries. I think in some they'll always be that way. I have a friend who has always worked remote, and what I hear her often complaining about is the lack of people being polite in their email communications, and they can be rather harsh with one another. So that's something that you're going to have to deal with if you're in a fully remote environment too. So there's pros and cons to everything.
Yeah, and this isn't for this webinar, but I just sort of wonder when employment changes, will a lot of this change? Because right now people are hungry, companies are hungry to find people, and I just wonder when the market shifts, how much of this will change.
But isn't that what it always happens? Isn't there always market correction? Isn't, you're going to lose that salesperson because they want to work remotely and they don't want to travel. So you lose that person and you lose Barry, and you realize 6 months later as his manager, I probably should have made an accommodation. So the next time a Barry comes along and asks me to work in a hybrid model, I'm going to consider it. I mean, I think the concept of, Gershon, you mentioned the guy at Goldman Sachs who works 18 hours but is not productive after 12. Aren't we kind of in an era where we should identify that as leaders and say, why am I requiring that guy to work an extra 6 hours if he's not productive after 12 hours? Is it just because the guy or the woman in the office next to him is working 18 hours? And I think that's the greatest thing that's happened in the last 19 months is the fact that the old traditional approach is being questioned on almost every front in terms of why did we always do this? And with this, we're all on 24/7. So the question is, if I can do it from home and I can show that I can do it from home, great. If I can't do it from home and I've shown I can't do it from home, then you got to come to the office. I've had clients, they question whether they're going to have employees that were lazy and kind of just, sitting around in their pajamas eating cereal all day. And I tell them, yeah, they're probably doing that in the office, though. They're probably on the internet all day. They're probably, if you think that person's not productive, chances are that person's not productive. They're not whether they're at home or in the office. So I'm invigorated by the last 19 months in terms of showing that technology can work and it'll only get better. And then I also know, because I've been, I'm 50, I've been in business for years. I love the in-person stuff. I love meeting people. So I think we'll land somewhere in the middle. And I think the question is what we have to do versus what we can do. And I think it's all playing out. We're writing the math as we go along.
No, I think you're right. I think the pendulum will swing a little bit back the other way, and we'll probably meet somewhere in the middle. And that does make a lot of sense. Anything else from the Barrys, or anything else you wanted to add or Alyson?
I would just add to that last point when Noah was saying in this conversation, how Goldman made one decision, PwC made a very, very opposite decision. I don't think these things happen in a vacuum. Goldman has always been notorious for the 18-hour workdays. So it would have been shocking. I wasn't in that meeting. I wasn't in the room when they were discussing what they were going to do moving forward, but it's not surprising to hear that they're telling everyone to come back. PwC has been much more flexible in recent years, way before the pandemic. I have a friend that's been working at PwC for a number of years. He's been on a very, very, very flexible schedule. He's been traveling the country while he's doing his job for years before the pandemic. So it's not surprising to me to see how they, how their reaction was, their determination was. So it speaks in general to the culture of the company, to what Noah was saying, that these things don't happen in a vacuum. They didn't flip a coin. It's how their culture is. And Gershon, whether they're making them work 18 hours a day, even though their productivity drops after 12, they know that they're doing it anyway. Why? Don't ask me. They have a reason for it. They know about it. And that's just how they operate.
It's called money. Goldman's always made money. So why change it if it's not broken, right?
Right.
That's a good point too. So Alyson, any last words? Any final words for us?
I think Noah's points are good ones to end on. I found, just me personally speaking, so my firm has always allowed people to work from home. It hasn't really been a full-time thing, but we've had flexibility to do it. And pre-March 2020, you always sort of felt like a little bit of shame when you were, and it has nothing to do with my company, but I think there was a stigma attached necessarily from having a remote position. And I think that since everything was mandated to shift, it's brought these types of issues to the surface in terms of what we want from our employers as employees and what we're looking for. And I'm excited to see how it develops, but there's winners and losers in any pendulum swing. We've seen public transportation take a major hit. The roads are more congested because people don't want to get on public transportation. And what's going to happen if that system crumbles? We have to figure that out. What's going to happen to all these buildings that are vacant? Who's going to fill them if no one's coming into an office? We've already seen what's happened with the housing market after people were stuck in their houses for a long period of time. So we're going to see continued change and adaptation in the workplace. And I think these other factors that we wouldn't have thought would be okay to bring into the conversation. That was a positive side of the pandemic, that it kind of gave us permission to say it's okay. You know, if I have a child or a dog making noise in the background, no one was fazed by it a year ago. You know, they're a little bit more fazed by it now, but it kind of gave you permission to have other options available to you in terms of getting your job done.
No, I agree. Barry, any last minute thoughts?
No, I think we covered a lot, and I think we're ending on a very nice note over here. We laid out a lot of areas to think about, both on the legal side and also on the HR side. And I think we've done a very good job. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thanks everybody for being here. And you know, if as when we normally end these things, I'm not sure if anybody on the webinar doesn't know us, but you know, feel free to reach out to us. You know, we'd love to have a quick consultation with anybody just to talk about what's going on in your world and see if we can help. Again, we're Imperial Advisory, and you know, thanks for coming.